Tony Robbins says the fourth turning offers bold predictions about how all of us can prepare, individually and collectively, for humanity's next rendezvous with destiny. Spiritually, the Age of Aquarius has long been the anthem for such profound change. And of course, the Hindus have for centuries talked about the impending transition from the dark age of Kali Yuga to the light age of Satya Yuga, where virtues, values, and ethical living are mandatory. Today, in this fascinating interview, David lays out the timings and markers using astrological signals of when and how the Age of Aquarius and the fourth turning will begin, and how you can embrace the unstoppable changes on the horizon. Hey there, Truth Seeker. Welcome to the Star Kittens community, where we discuss 13 sign astrology. Are you in alignment with your divine design? Do you want to master the metaphysical reality? Open the doors of perception. Each planetary body is an archetype, a template, if you will, that helps us interpret human behavior in the world around us. The more awake and aware we are, the more synchronicity will show up in your life. Our focus today is the Aquarius New Moon. We will spotlight and interpret the 10th square with Jupiter in Taurus, the conjunction of Uranus with Sedna, also in Taurus, and the transformative square between Haumea and Pluto. To help us reach more souls with this important message, please like, share, and subscribe. There's a lot going on, so let's jump in. Kia ora, David.
Kia ora.
You excited for this one? We had a good conversation about this beautiful configuration and the next few full moons and other big transitions. So I think you're going to have lots of beautiful information to share with us. But just for the people listening and on the screen, we will show that this new moon is occurring on the 28th of February here in New Zealand, where the sun and moon are conjunct at 11 degrees Aquarius. So where would you like to start off today?
Yeah, I am pretty excited about this. It's there's a once in 11,400 year event taking place. So got to be excited about that because we won't get a chance to talk about that again, not in our lifetimes anyway. So the event I'm talking about involves Sedna, who we've touched on previously, but Sedna's certainly in the mix, and we will come to her in a moment. But she takes about almost 12,000 years to orbit the sun. So the position that she's in at the moment in Taurus, in a conjunction with Uranus and a relationship with Pluto, is extremely rare. So for that reason alone, I'm excited to talk about that. But an Aquarius new moon signals that there's a series of cyclical and dramatic changes laying ahead for humanity, and they involve two things. One, Mother Earth, and two, great institutional powers that control us via what I call a cognitive map, and that's represented by Saturn and Pluto. Pluto has just begun her orbit into, where is it, Capricorn? It's Capricorn, isn't it? So yeah. Pluto has just gone into Capricorn, and that happened in December last year. It was a momentous event, not only for the fact that it's the first time in 250 odd years, 247 or 248 to be exact, that Pluto has changed a sign and gone into Capricorn at that point. It was also involving a new moon in Ophiuchus. So it was an incredibly powerful and auspicious time and a marker of some of these cycles that we're going to talk about. So that Pluto cycle moving into Capricorn began it'll take 17 years for her to move through there. And that's very important when it comes to understanding some of the big picture events that are taking place. So overall, this is about humanity evolving from matter to spirit. The human genome mutates, and I'll discuss a little bit more about that in a moment. This is where we get to over these next 17 years or so, reclaim our full faculties. That's our extrasensory perception, our shape-shifting ability, our ability to astral travel, our heightened intuition. We get to reclaim that. We get to experience and enjoy emancipation and freedom from debt, slavery, and subjugation, those institutions of Saturn. And we get to reclaim our sovereignty, our autonomy, and connection with source consciousness. So today, specifically, we are going to identify where in humanity this genomic mutation, this age of Aquarius, this leap in consciousness, this break in the timelines based on astrology will start. We'll talk about the dates and the timing of two critical cycles involving Saturn and Pluto. We will also weave in the very important and indigenous myths of Sedna, which is an Inuit or Eskimo tale, and of Haumea, which is a Hawaiian tale, because they are important signposts for us to recognize at this particular point in time. Overall, what we are going to discuss is our relationship as humanity, as a collective with the earth, with water, with marine life, with the Arctic regions and the polar ice caps. Those latter two subjects are, of course, linked to Sedna, but we will get to that in a moment.
It's interesting because the Age of Aquarius, we've done a blog last year where we very much touched on Saturn being in Aquarius in the 60s. There was such a tumultuous time, and I wonder if in 50 odd years we'll look back at now and how many changes occurred when Saturn, is again in Aquarius. So it's on its last legs. It is about to say farewell to Aquarius and stepping into Pisces. So how is that change? What do you feel? What do you see coming with that big change?
Yeah, look, it's huge. And yes, we have talked about the 60s, particularly that 1964 to 1966 period, which was not, to be clear, the last time Saturn was in Aquarius.
Sorry.
Um,
Yes, thank you.
um, Saturn went into Aquarius, of course, 28 years after that. So that would have been around in the 80s sometime. But there was a very important period when Saturn was in this location back in the 60s, in the mid 60s. And in fact, that's where the Age of Aquarius was born. We won't do a history lesson here, but there was so much that went on last time these two were paired up. But Saturn entering Pisces is equally as important in this Age of Aquarius, because the way we are interpreting this is that there are different layers or stages and processes that have to unfold for humanity to evolve and awaken en masse, this is. And part of this, using astrology as a markers of time, is Saturn's transit into Pisces, which occurs, interestingly, just 2 days before the blood moon lunar eclipse on the 14th of March. So that's not far away. That's a couple of weeks away. And we're left under no illusion at all as astrologers that the combination of Saturn going into Pisces, so changing signs, which is always a momentous event when you've got these big planets, just 2 days before a blood moon lunar eclipse, which is going to be extremely powerful and profound for humanity. It gives us a lot of insights. But let's step back for a moment and look at Saturn and what it represents in astrology. In our view, Saturn represents institutions, which are the rules and the norms that organize society. They include the political, the economic, and the social relationships, the demographics. These institutions, or Saturnian structures, if you like, can be formal or informal, and they can be established by laws, by regulations, or customs. They exist because, one, we, humanity, have given power to these Saturnian institutions, and two, because they take power from humanity, or they usurp it from humanity. What do these institutions look like? What are the features of these institutions? Just so we can level set here. When we're talking about Saturnian structures or institutions and what is up for change between Saturn's transit beginning in the next couple of weeks with this blood moon. So for 3 years, so from March 2025 to March 2028 is a key period in this awakening process for humanity. So these institutions, what I call a cognitive map, shape our behavior. These institutions influence how we as a collective behave and make decisions. They provide us with a structure. These institutions, or Saturnian structures, which sometimes last for years, hundreds of years, 50 years, 100 years or more, they create a predictable framework for the way that we interact socially, economically, and politically with each other. They change over time. They can change incrementally or suddenly, and they are or should be regularly reformed. So the transit of Pisces or Saturn through Pisces is about the reformation of these institutions. Institutions can be hard to change because Saturn's cycle is 28 years, and sometimes these structures can be around for 4 or 5 of Saturn's cycles. So therefore, these institutions, these Saturnian structures, these behaviors that they exude and exhibit can be difficult to change both at an individual and collective level. And they can have positive or negative outcomes. The ripple effects of institutions depend on the behaviors that they encourage in humanity, but also in the people who sit inside these institutions and the relationships that they enable. So with that said, is there anything you'd like to add or comment on?
Well, some of the like when I think of schools, for example, we've often spoke about, the writing, arithmetic, and reading, the 3 R's, the way that they've done that. That's for a long time, and so yes, I find it difficult to imagine, right, some of these institutions to drastically change. But I'm here for the ride. So, what other kind of examples could you share with us?
Yeah, and that's a really good one. And again, just to be clear, why are we talking about Saturn and institutions in the Age of Aquarius or the context of the Age of Aquarius? Well, we'll build up to that picture, but just for this purpose, for now, this cycle of 3 years between the lunar eclipse, the blood moon of March 2025 and March 2028, when Saturn goes through Pisces, which is the sign of dissolution, by the way. And also the end of a long cycle too. Saturn, of course, is now getting to the end of its own 28-year cycle when it gets to Pisces. So this is a very important event. And this is why we're talking about these institutions, because it'll give us some idea of what's on the table in terms of change and to make sense of what we see going on around us. So institutions, as we've touched on, can be formal. For example, they can be the laws that grant and protect us property rights. They can be informal. These can be communal systems of say, the collective, a group of farmers looking after a local well, for example. So that's an informal institution. It's a set of agreements. It's how we behave. Marriage is a classic institution, a long-standing custom and tradition that is accepted as an important part of society. With Saturn going through Pisces, that's on the table, and that may well be modified in the next 3 years. Other institutions, of course, are organizations, foundations, think tanks, not non-government organizations, corporations. These institutions create for us, humanity, collectively and individually, a framework to understand production and consumption and communication and exchange. The term institution is used in many disciplines, and this I find quite interesting as well, which includes sociology, philosophy, politics, geography, and economics. So it has wide and diverse impacts on all of us.
Absolutely. Yeah, so you see it, so it is the archetype for institutions. For me also it was the taskmaster, it's the pushing. I've mentioned this before on the blog when I was going through my first Saturn return. It really was that taskmaster helping me get along to do my master's at that time. So it was so interesting going through Capricorn and how we really noticed that not many people were engaging with our content. And you said people don't like Saturn. It's Saturn, Capricorn. People have this, they don't want to know. So these institutions, for some of these institutions to dissolve, people might become ostriches and just put their head in the sand.
Yeah, absolutely. There's, having done astrology for 40 years, all the signs are relevant and all signs are important and all signs have their place, their dark side, their light side. But certainly, um, you know, Capricorn and Saturn, people tend to have pretty strong reactions one way or the other to this particular astrology and discussions and interpretations about it. But going back to institutions, so Saturn, as we mentioned, and as you've just reinforced there, is the archetype of institutions. And it's therefore incredibly important to understand the role that Saturn plays via these institutions in our lives. I mean, some examples include governments. Who's not affected by the governments around the world? The EU is an institution. Bretton Woods is an institution. The WHO, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, Wall Street, Washington, D.C., the Catholic Church, nation states, the courts and judiciary. Hollywood is an institution.
Mm.
International trade, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is called GATT. A lot of people don't understand that that's underneath a lot of what's going on at the moment, but that's certainly a Saturnian institution. The Versailles Treaty, the Plaza Accords, the Kyoto Protocol, all institutions. The Paris Climate Agreement, NATO, healthcare, which you mentioned, and education before, pension plans, and the military-industrial complex. All of them are institutions. Now, if we imagine that in this next 3 years, and it's going to have a pretty fiery beginning, this entry of Saturn into Pisces, because it is effectively at the same time. Yeah, it's 2 days before, but it's basically at the same time as a blood moon lunar eclipse that has got a lot of people's imagination fired up at the moment. And of course, on the 12 sign, they will be missing the fact that this is happening. So really important when I mention all of those institutions, and that's just a snapshot of them. But every single one of those is touching people all over the world. And there's no way that we can avoid interacting with institutions.
Yeah. No way, unless you live under a rock somewhere in the desert, or in the desert, under a lot of sand there. So you slowly, or you slightly spoke about the big cycle of Saturn, the 28-year cycle of it in itself. We believe that we start a new beginning at Aries, and so Pisces being that last sign to go through, the sign of dissolution and emergence. How would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, look, and that's a really good point. So if we go back, if we think that this cycle of 28 years will end in 2028, that means that it began in the year 2000, which was a fascinating period. So when Saturn was first in Aries, for those that will remember the year 2000, there was all of this around the institutions of computers and big tech at that stage. I mean, big tech's evolved now, but back then, the whole world was worried about Y2K. We were talking about, I don't think there was anybody who wouldn't have been aware that there was this great fear, which actually coincided with Saturn going through Aries and the end and the beginning of a 28-year cycle, that the institutions of technology and everything that was linked to it, the World Wide Web and everything, was all going to switch off. There was this crazy talk that Y2K meant that the computer programming that sat in behind the infrastructure was going to stop, and that was going to be the end of the world. So, you know, these moves of Saturn are huge, even though we might not acknowledge it. But this is why we're taking a bit of time just to talk about it, because we'll see in a moment as we get later into the discussion how important this is as a piece of understanding what's going on in the world around us as we prepare for the age of Aquarius. So the Saturnian institutions, the last house, as mentioned, or the last time that he was in Aries, which is the end of this, so Pisces giving way to Aries, was the year 2000. Under Pisces energy from the blood moon of March 2025 to March 2028, so this final, most intense piece of Saturn's 28-year transit, the hypermasculinity of those institutions, the control, they're actually all control structures, by the way, will begin to systematically dissolve and disintegrate as they are no longer suited to the evolution of humanity's mindset and our orientation towards the next phase of humanity, which is much more spiritual practice. Let me just touch on what I mean by spiritual practice so we're clear. In this context, spirit means the involvement of and the integration of spirit into those institutions, so they become much more customer and focused and service oriented as opposed to self-serving. They become collaborative, they become inclusive, they become welcoming, they become supportive, they become consensus based and basically more feminine. Pisces represents the collective unconsciousness, and Aquarius, which is where this new moon is, represents the collective consciousness. So we have the collective unconsciousness of Pisces, that which we shy away from, and you touched on that before. It's very interesting that often Capricorn, Saturnian people individually and collectively shy away from it. That's the collective unconsciousness, yet Aquarius is the collective consciousness. These two are coming together, and between the collective consciousness and the unconsciousness, which is basically institutional memories, is what I call a cognitive map of Saturn's control structures. This is how Pisces and Aquarius and Saturn as the lord of time and karmic cycles correspond to evolutionary change and the impulse for evolutionary change as we move from matter to spirit. Now, for humanity to evolve from matter to spirit, as Richard Rudd talks about with Gene Key 55, a lot of you will be familiar with that through the Human Design System. He's all over the internet. He's not the only one talking about this evolution of consciousness, but in his terms, he calls that Gene Key 55. But that is this evolution from matter. So Saturn represents the pinnacle of human achievement, the pinnacle of matter, because Saturn gives way to Aquarius and ultimately Pisces. So when we talk about what Rudd talks about with Gene Key 55 of humanity evolving from matter to spirit, what we're talking about here is this idea that we've reached the pinnacle of materialism and this godlessness and this hyper masculine expression of these institutions. I'm not going to read them all out before that I touched on, but I think if you go back and listen to every single one of those institutions, we would consider, most of us, for them to be godless and lacking humanity, and certainly not interested in serving the consciousness in any way that is beneficial. In fact, most people that work inside those, or many that work inside those institutions, are in fact self-serving and you know, blind to the actual function and purpose of institutions in terms of humanity's evolution.
Yes, we don't care about the little man. It was like we indulged in some TV watching, and we were quite excited that the latest episode of 1923 was out. And there was this scene of an Native American female and male having a conversation, and they were talking about government, and she asked like why don't we just step away, or what? I can't recall word for word, but the male was saying, well, the government don't want us to find out that we don't need them. Because as soon as we do that, as soon as we realize that if we go en masse, if we come together and say enough is enough, we're not going to play your way anymore because you are not for the people.
Yeah.
The governments don't want that to happen, because then that institution will be gone.
Yeah. Perfect. There's a whole lot of conversation going on in humanity, though, and I'm going to join the dots a little bit here about this evolution of consciousness. We started with the idea of the Age of Aquarius, but we've also got the gene key 55, the evolution from matter to spirit. But there's a whole bunch of other, let's call them, they're not institutions, but they are thought, concepts, ideas that have been kicked around sometimes for, well, in some cases, hundreds, if not thousands of years. In the philosophy, or the school, if you like, the school, which is an institution, the institution of theosophy, they talk about a root race concept, and what that refers to is the successive evolutionary stages through which humanity goes in its pilgrimage on the physical plane. So when you talk about or think about, if you are listening to anything to do with this human design system and this gene key 55 activation, Rudd talks about the idea that to move from matter to spirit, we need to move from victimization to freedom. Now, Pisces, interestingly, is where a lot of that victimization is residing. So as Saturn comes through, if Saturn is the structures and the institutions that have caused some of that disempowerment you talked about, where we've become subjugated, oppressed, repressed, they've thrust their ideas upon us, even though that may not have been to the best benefit of society. A lot of these institutions have been, particularly lately, have gone rogue. But there's a sense of victimization that resides in humanity, and part of the key to evolving from matter to spirit is actually dealing with that victimization, because we need to confront it and realize that actually we're not victims. We just allowed these big institutions to railroad us. But the root race theories and prophecies are really interesting. They're well documented. They first started, and you and I were talking about this before, but with Madam Blavatsky in, interestingly, 1888. And before that, the Vedic sages talked about these ideas. But the whole idea of root race theories and the successive evolutionary steps, which is these ages of awakening, these epochs, these massive shifts in humanity, it's all to do with genetic mutations or activation of multiple strands of DNA within our genome. We think that genetic upgrades, that's you and I, subscribe to the idea that genetic upgrades are actually linked to Uranian awakenings. And we spent a lot of time talking about that in the last blog. And so therefore Uranus is a key marker of these awakenings of our genome and in astrological transitions, which means that, like lightning, that Uranus awakening can happen quickly and can come without warning. Now, for humanity prepare for this evolutionary leap from matter to spirit, we need to recognize that these Saturnian institutions have inflicted enormous pain on the collective because we gave them the power to do so. We surrendered right across humanity, no matter the race, no matter the culture, no matter the sex, no matter the background. Humanity has surrendered our sovereignty and our autonomy to faceless bureaucracies and unelected officials who have decided that they can think and decide what's best for the collective. Consequently, we, humanity, and individually, but collectively, we have forgotten how to think. And we have lost our confidence, which is what the Leo blood moon is all about. We've lost our mojo, so to speak, and so we've become disempowered. This blood moon coming up in a couple of weeks' time in 13 sign is in Leo, and we just spent the last blog talking about how important Leo is as the energy or the underpinning or the framework of confident self-expression, of mojo, of self-esteem. And that, from an individual response to these Saturnian institutions, is often we lose our spirit. So these Saturnian institutions have engendered, interestingly too, a massive global grievance industry that seeks retribution and restitution for past wrongs. In other words, in spiritual terms, karmic rebalancing. Now, you don't have to go far on this planet to look and see that happening, particularly with indigenous peoples rising up all over the world and reclaiming some of their birthrights. We see that in Australia. We see that in Africa. We've certainly seen it in our own country of New Zealand. So with that said, any thoughts on any of that?
It's such an interesting conversation, and probably not the right place to have this, but it's of course we all should have the right to live where we want to live. And then if you think what the Westerners have done both in Australia and New Zealand, I don't know too much of the depth of other parts of the world, but it's atrocious of pushing down religions into cultures where they were so connected with the earth. They were so connected with different gods. My son loves the Maori legends of Maui and how he fished up the island and how he slowed the sun, but no, the Westerners came here and you had to believe in different things. How dare we, because I am a Westerner, how dare we thrust that upon others? So it's a difficult subject. I am Dutch originally. The Dutch are very guilty of plundering other parts of the world. And yeah, I think everyone pretty much would look back at that part of history and kind of like shakes their head. But we look forward. So what is there to look forward to?
Well, look, yeah, I mean, you're touching on the institutions or corporations, of course. If you think about the Dutch East Indies Company, there was also the plundering of the British in India. There's been, a history of religious conquering, and that's not just been Christianity. It's been all religions trying to enforce their institutions, their belief systems. And again, just to be clear, the institutions are effectively belief systems, right? They are, this is how you behave, and that's why school is a classic example of it. So for us to evolve, though, the big picture, and you talk about looking forward, if we are to take this evolutionary leap that many are talking about, which we're calling the Age of Aquarius for simplicity, this is part of the process of getting there. This is part of the pathway. And we need to confront Saturn, and Saturn is going to confront us whether we like it or not through this next 3-year period from March 2025 to March 2028. Because the very definition of Saturn, of institutions going through Pisces, which is dissolution and emergence, is that all of these institutions and these grievances and these wrongs, perceived wrongs, rights or wrongs, retributions, rebalancing, karmic pain, all need to come to the surface. And so, we're predicting the next 3 years from that perspective is going to be really messy. And people will reach out to institutions like The Hague and the International Criminal Court and so on and so forth. There's just all kinds of stuff that's going to go on, but it's part of the process of humanity evolving from matter, the physical world, to spirit. And for the timelines to shift, I mean, all of us can turn on YouTube or podcasts and spiritual, and everyone's talking about timeline shifting. To us, this is the practical steps of how timelines shift. Because timeline shifting is about consciousness shifting ultimately, and genetic upgrades as well. So for those timelines to shift, excuse me, we need to tackle the unconscious effects of these deleterious, overbearing institutions and confront our collective pain, which is symbolized by and contained within the Pisces energetics. We can do this by recognizing the limitations and lunacy of our collective thinking. Then and only then, after the collapse of institutions, the Saturnian control structures, can we seed a vision for a new humanity, which of course will start in Aries and a brand new 28-year cycle. And that timing of that is March 2028. So the next 3 years are going to be rocky, no doubt about it. So in summary, the Saturn summary here is that there are 2 cycles that are underpinning the transition from matter to spirit. There's the Saturn cycle, which we've just talked about, of institutions and institutional collapse. And there's the Plutonic or Pluto cycle, which we're going to touch on next. The beginning of one key cycle, Saturn, as I mentioned right at the outset, interestingly coincides with this blood moon. So Saturn enters Pisces on March the 12th, and then on March the 14th, just 2 days later, we have this powerful blood moon lunar eclipse in Leo. The lunar eclipse, by the way, is about regaining our confidence. I mentioned that before, our self-esteem and our resolve. That will be the overriding theme of that lunar eclipse, but within the context of these institutions. So effectively, that means we need to start thinking about over the next 3 years, individually and collectively, how we can take back our power, our mojo, our autonomy, our sovereignty, where we've become disempowered because we've allowed these institutions to dominate us so much. Saturn's Pisces entry signals a step in the evolutionary, a big step in the evolutionary force of moving from matter to spirit. This part of the cycle will go for 3 years. I've mentioned that, March 2028, when Saturn enters Aries and begins another 28-year cycle. I've always found it interesting that Saturn cycles of 4 sevens, 7 fours are 28. So actually each 7 years is a mini cycle. And we'll come back to that. Just hold that thought for a moment. Saturn represents, therefore, within the context of the Age of Aquarius and the unfolding of this process, the pinnacle of matter and materialism, which is enshrined in governance structures or government, religion, institutions, politics, economics, finance, trade, and so on and so forth. 2025 to 2028, just round the corners, heralds a time when a great paradigm shift from matter and materialism of Saturn will begin to give way to the spirit and consensus of Pisces and Aquarius. A new vision, which will come in Aries, by the way, but we will begin to see it first in the next 3 years, for the great institutions, a new vision will emerge in the next 3 years that connects and influences our collective behavior to emerge progressively. And that process is going to begin, we think, in March 2025. We think this is the end of the fourth turning. For those of you who have heard of the fourth turning, certainly Tony Robbins is all over this, but it's called the Strauss-Howe theory. And it's very interesting when we're talking about institutions, as I wrap this up, that Steve Bannon, Trump's first chief strategist, was featured in Time magazine in 2016. You can look this up, talking about the fourth turn and what cycles of history tell us about America's next rendezvous with destiny. Bannon believed, excuse me, look, he was a chief advisor or strategist, Trump at the time. He believed that the institution of the United States presidency and the White House were pivotal to the fourth turning manifesting. So think about these little numerological correspondences. And we are apolitical. We're just pointing this out, by the way, just so we're clear. This is not about Trump, but it's just interesting that his first strategic advisor was talking about the fourth turning, and here we are the second time around. But he's number 47, which is an 11. So for those who like their numbers and the gematria, that's interesting. The Congress is the 119th, which is also 11. And this has been convened in 2025, 579, a 9-year, which is the end of a cycle.
Yes, I highly recommend people look into this fourth tuning. I'm listening to the audiobook myself, and it's this cycle and how history repeats itself in a way, and looking at the different generations within these cycles, how each generation from the baby boomers to the millennials, how we all react differently in certain situations. So yeah, thank you for introducing me to the fourth tuning and Tony Robbins being all over it. I'm sure there'll be a few people listening to us that will be interested in that knowledge as well. So we're going to leave Saturn just on the back burner for now, and we're going to go back into Pluto in Capricorn. We have spoken about Pluto a fair few times. If you are interested in understanding this beautiful Pluto energy more, then go back through our previous blogs, especially on YouTube, where all of them will be available. But of course, Capricorn is Saturn's home sign, and there's this beautiful relationship between these two. So how would you like to interpret that?
Yeah, look, the resonance is stunning, and yeah, I can't overstate how important these movements of these big planets are, because when we step back for a second and think that Pluto's cycle is just under 250 years, that means that it is unlikely, unless there's some major biological breakthroughs, but of course that could happen as we move into this new genomic upgrade period. It could happen where we end up living for 200, 300 years. That may well happen. But at the moment, as it stands, there are none of us alive listening today that were around the last time that Pluto was in Capricorn. And there's none of us that will be alive when it happens again in 250 years. So we are privileged right now to be even talking about these things. And we haven't even got to the once in 11,400 year relationship with Sedna, but that's to come. So keep listening. But this Pluto in Capricorn, again, because of the 12 sign and the 13 sign, there are many who will not be talking, of course, about where Pluto is at in reality, like where and we assign Pluto as a feminine deity, by the way, where many will call Pluto a masculine, but for us she's a feminine energy because it's a water sign, and therefore it's feminine. A second part of understanding humanity's transition from matter to spirit in terms of the timing and the fourth turning is Pluto. Pluto moved into Capricorn in December 2024, which we mentioned before, but at the same time, interestingly, no coincidence, there was an Ophiuchus, the 13th sign, new moon. Pluto's transit or cycle through Capricorn, which is the energy and pinnacle of matter, as we've talked about. And the reason, or how we arrive at that with Saturn, is that there's 3 earth signs. And of course, there's Taurus, there's Virgo, and there's Capricorn. And Capricorn is the pinnacle of those 3. So that is the pinnacle of matter. That's how we arrive at that idea. So as Pluto transits through Capricorn, Saturn's home sign, the energy in the pinnacle of matter will be stirred up. Now, this is going to take 17 years, an interesting number as well. So till 2042, 422, which is 8, and 17, which is 8. 17, interestingly, is the star in the tarot, which signifies hope, healing, and renewal. The star card represents transformation and growth in the physical and spiritual aspects of life. Fascinating, right? Where Saturn as the guardian of Capricorn represents institutions, Saturn in Pisces is symbolized by the dissolution of institutional memory i.e. the pain that is residing in the collective consciousness. And we touched on some of that before about the plundering of resources and big institutions, moving around the world and doing what they were doing. Colonialization is what they're typically called. So the dissolution of institutional memory as Saturn moves through Pisces is the pain residing in the collective unconsciousness that needs to be surfaced, it needs to be acknowledged and resolved. And that is a process astrologically that we believe begins with the blood moon eclipse starting March 14 and ends 3 years later in March 2028. Pluto's role here and the relationship with correspondence is Pluto is there to clean up the Saturn's energetic base and foundations. And that will occur through what we call the Plutonic pathway. And that Plutonic pathway was activated and will be activated from December 2024 for the next 17 years through to December 2042. 2024, by the way, is 8. So we've got 8-8 on both sides and 17 years, 8-8-8. Pluto conjunct Aquarius New Moon, that was back in December 24, carries the signature frequency and energetics of Ophiuchus. And we spent an enormous time talking about Ophiuchus as the integrator, the ether, and the wisdom of Mother God. So this is going to be infused in the 17-year. See Pluto as the cleanup crew coming through. If Saturn is in Pisces dealing with the institutions, then Pluto is dealing with the house of Saturn, which is Capricorn, and cleaning it all up through this Plutonic pathway. And we'll touch on that, which is the three pieces, and we've spoken of this before, but the energies of Pluto going through Capricorn, she is going to transmute negative energies. That's the pain and victimization of humanity from these institutions, and that will come through awareness. She will then transcend the self-limiting beliefs that we have, the cognitive map. If institutions are belief structures, a typical example might be that the WHO says something and we all follow that path, or most of us, or the government says something and we all follow that path. That's a belief structure. And so the transcending of those beliefs is also part of the Plutonic pathway, or the cleaning up. And we're going to do that by reframing our relationship with these institutions. And finally, we're going to transform the orientation and see the transformation of the direction and the focus of these institutions. But we will see that when we take action. You and I were talking earlier about a case of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC, where is the largest mines of cobalt in the world, which goes into every single electronic and digital device. And there's institutions there, i.e. mining companies, Anglo-American and a couple of others are there, and they're plundering the resources. Yet you would think that the Democratic Republic of the Congo would be the richest people on the planet, or but yet they are among the poorest. This is what we are talking about. That institution is imbalanced. It is hyper-masculine, and it is incredibly taking no interest in regard for the people of that land. And that is that action. And we said that if you look in Peru and some of the global South nations, the miners just say to these institutions, these big companies, we're just not going to work in your mine anymore until the conditions change. And the institutions are forced to change. So this is what we mean about transformation. And finally, just to wrap this bit up, we're going to talk about the Pluto square to Haumea and the trine to Sedna.
And that we are. So just to set the scene, so Pluto at the beginning stages of Capricorn, Sedna is sitting in Taurus, and Haumea, whom we haven't yet spoken about, she sits at the later stages of Virgo. So all three actually are sitting in a earth sign. I've got that correct? Yes, Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn.
Yeah.
So Sedna, we know a little bit about. I'm sure you'll go in there again. The goddess of the Inuit, the Arctic first people, and then Haumea is related to the first people, the native religion as such, of Hawaii, a place that I have not yet been, but it's definitely on my list. And beautiful, not conjunctions, but a square and trine with Pluto. So how do you interpret these energies?
I mean, it amazed me actually, and we spent a lot of time talking about how we were going to frame this particular blog. And the more we looked at it, the more depth there was. Because of all of these astrological configurations, it was like, oh, I hadn't even thought about how important the myth and the messaging and the morals of Sedna and Haumea are in terms of teaching us about this evolutionary leap from matter to spirit. You see, these institutions, I think that one of the biggest things that we're going to confront, this is humanity, both individually and collectively, over these 3-year period, which I think is beginning in March 25 through to March 28, as Pisces, Saturn goes through Pisces. I think one of the biggest themes around the world is going to be First Nations peoples who have been subjugated by institutions, who have been colonized, who have been imperialized, who have been robbed, who have been forgotten about. And their tales and their stories will be part of what emerges through this institutional dissolution and dissolving. And some of those stories will become way more prominent in the way that the institutions are configured and structured in the future. And they will have regard for these stories and what they actually mean, the moral of the story being, and how important it is for us now in this next 3 years to really listen to and to go back and reflect upon some of these stories. And the fact that Sedna and Haumea are involved both in earth signs, as you say, is absolutely no coincidence. But before I touch on that, is there anything that you want to throw into the mix here?
No, I'm excited to hear what you've got to share. Thank you.
All right. So I touched before, and just before I get into Haumea and Sedna, there's a lot of conversation and there's a lot of different let's call them communities around the world talking about awakening in humanity. And they're all coming at it from kind of slightly different angles, but they're all actually aiming at the same thing, which is that there is an evolutionary leap that's starting, that's going to happen. And what we're talking about today is the actual timing of that using astrological movements of these bigger planets, particularly Saturn and Pluto. But let's just have a look at what some of these other communities briefly, what they're talking about. So the process of Aquarian awakening, Age of Aquarius is one of these communities. Richard Rudd's Gene Key 55 activation is another. Strauss-Howe's The Fourth Turning is another. The concepts of the seven root races that was seeded based on the Vedic cosmology of the Manvantaras, the cosmic cycles, and the various prophetic utterances from First Peoples, the theosophy of Madam Blavatsky in 1888, there's that 888 again, and Rudolf Steiner, the bifurcation of timelines, many communities are talking about that, contact by ETs that are part of our star families and star lineages, star seeds, that's all part of this as well. And the transition, and they, by the way, those ET contacts making it because we are said to be evolving, and so we'll be more receptive to reconnecting with our soul families and star families who don't physically have this body. That's part of the evolution. That's why the timing is interesting for that ET contact. And of course, the Hindus have been talking about this. They also talk about a fourth turning, by the way. So Strauss-Howe and Tony Robbins, who talk about the fourth turning, that's not original insofar as the Hindus have talked about the Kali Yuga, rather, which is the fourth and final dark age of materialism and matter, which we think is personified in the dark side of Saturn institutions. There's a transition happening as we speak to Satya Yuga, the age of truth, or the golden age, which is the age of ethical living and harmony. And all of these concepts that I've just touched on refer to the same thing: massive and unavoidable change. So at this new moon in Aquarius, all of these ideas are amplified by Jupiter. We think that the Aquarian age timing can be mapped, therefore, using 13 sign astrology. And this is the gift to us from the universal mind. The entry of Saturn to Pisces, beginning with the blood moon on March 14 in a couple of weeks' time, through to March 2028, a 3-year process, is part of the deal. The entry of Pluto to Capricorn in December 2024, which combined with an Aquarius New Moon, began the arduous process of regenerating the dark shadow side of materialism as invoked by the devil card in the tarot. 2024 and 8 in numerology, again, 8 is matter, which also symbolize, well, as matter, as I've just mentioned, kicks off. So this is Pluto, kicks off a 17-year cycle, another 8, through to 2042, also an 8, to give us another part of the Aquarian age timeline. Now, just before I touch on the trine of Pluto to Sedna and Taurus, any reactions?
I love that you always are able to bring in different aspects, the numerology, and then the devil card. We've shown that on the screen many times. If you haven't seen it before, look it up, go to Wikipedia, because it has the original, in quotation, image of the Rider-Waite deck. It is this devil-like creature, the Baphomet, if I've say that correctly, with a male and a female in front, and they've got chains, but these chains are able to be lifted off. They are loose, and one of them has a tail with grapes, that is the indulgence, and the other one has got the tail with the flame of passion. And we humans, we've become enslaved, again in quotations, to these systems, but we are spirit being having a human experience. We're so much more than this material world. And so let's change this Saturn Capricorn structure by having Pluto in this energy, and see what changes she can enable us to do.
Yeah, and that perfectly, that is the key here. I mean, we've mentioned before that how many correspondences and relationships there are between tarot, numerology, astrology, and I'm sure there's other divination type processes, but certainly no coincidence. Pluto will take 17 years. The number 17 is the star. That card relates to Aquarius. 1 and 7, which you were born under as a 17, is an 8. It started in 2024, which is an 8. It will take 17 years, which is 8, and it will end in 2042, which is an 8. So 888, very featured, very strongly featured. The 8 is such a strong symbol, especially when it's turned on its side, of matter, the movement of matter, and the changing of form. And this is a perfect segue into why these stories from the Inuit in Sedna and Haumea are so important. But let's start with Sedna. So just as you mentioned before, Pluto is in a trine to Sedna. So this is a very favorable relationship between the two. So what's happening with the transformation of the energies of Saturnian structures? So his home sign, the structures themselves have been melted down and transformed in Pisces. The underlying energy of those structures, which is Capricorn, is going to be transformed and transmuted and transcended in the next 17 years. And part of the relationship here, or part of the key for a specific context, is the trine of Pluto to Sedna, which is sitting in Taurus, which only happens, by the way, once every 11,400 years. Just stunning what's going on here. So in addition to Pluto, so Pluto's got this connection with Sedna, and is also this square relationship, which is a bit more testy and difficult. with Haumea, but they give us a context for what this transition from matter to spirit, which you put so beautifully. We are spirit beings having a physical experience. So when we are transitioning from matter to spirit, we're actually just going back to our birthright. We're actually coming back into alignment with our divine design. And that's why these activation of all of these faculties of astral travel and shape shifting and not aging and so on, that's why all of them will come online. But of course, the Hindus talk about that transition from Kali Yuga, the darkness of matter, to Satya Yuga, which is the spirit, and living ethically and morally and with virtue and with value. But Sedna is an Inuit, and we mentioned before, or Eskimo tale of female subjugation. And that is a metaphor for the hypermasculinity of these institutions, which have basically subjugated the feminine side of humanity. That's why we're called, that's why we're in this patriarchal age, and the age of Aquarius is going to bring some balance back to that. So subjugation of females is a metaphor for the hyper masculinity of institutions. And Sedna's role here reminds us that we are connected to the Earth's waterways, marine life, the Arctic Circle, and the polar ice caps. Sedna represents our repressed knowledge of the vital connection of marine phytoplankton and the carbon cycle which sustains all life. Phytoplankton, like plants on the land, uses sunlight, which is consciousness, to convert carbon dioxide from the ocean surface into organic compounds through photosynthesis, forming the base of the marine food chain. The process of phytoplankton taking up carbon dioxide at the surface and transporting it to the deep ocean is called the biological pump, which we, humanity, have lost touch with. Thus, being more aware of the role of marine life, represented by Sedna, is critical to our evolutionary leap from the prison of matter, and you mentioned that before, represented by the devil card. We only feels like we are imprisoned because the chains around the neck can actually be uplifted. But we need to become more aware of Sedna's role in the evolutionary process and the ecosystem that sustains us. If we destroy the oceans, and we are certainly on track to do that, acidification and overfishing and sulfur emissions from all of the freighters and the ships that are traveling around, all kinds of stuff going on, undersea cables which are pumping EMFs, which are destroying the sonic frequencies of the mammals and the whales. There's all kinds of stuff that the construction of deep oil wells and the vibrations that emanate from these wind turbines, which are often put on the offshore. All of that's destroying the realms of Sedna. And Sedna's saying here, with this relationship with Pluto, you better not keep going, folks, because there's not going to be anything left. If we destroy the oceans, like we are with our institutionalized and dark thinking, which dark thinking is ignorance, Saturn, we will destroy humanity, and that's we collectively. Sedna's myth, therefore, is painful, and it's going to be painful confronting this as part of our evolutionary process as Saturn traverses Pisces between now and March 2025.
Yes, unfortunately for you, I'm not a big fan of eating fish, but there's just been something in my being that I can't make myself like it. And there's certain fish species that, like tuna, I can't, because I know how they're being fished. There's something in me that is connected to that part of life. So I know that there will be people that have that same aversion to eating any type of animal product, and there's no judgment. You do you, and you do what's right for you at that time. And I think if we as humanity can see Mother Earth and all that's on here as being part of life, not just as a resource, she is alive, and she'll let us know definitely when things have gone too far, and then who are we to stop that from going. So the next one is Haumea, and I'm really quite excited about this one. The first time I heard of this, I haven't even shared this with you, David, was in a book we got from the library. And that book from the library was all about Pluto being declassified as a planet and being called a dwarf planet. And Pluto had to find his way, her way, apologies, had to find her way as this new thing in our galaxy. Like I'm not a planet, but then am I an asteroid or a meteor or whatever? And it got to know Haumea and Sedna. And that was the first time I heard the name. And then through us doing research, she has got to do with the Hawaiian mythology. So tell us your story about it all.
Well, yeah, I love it when that happens, because that to me is just an example of the flow state, and that we pick up in consciousness sometimes just by, just doing, just acting, just being ourselves. And you weren't to know that we would suddenly be having a discussion about this. And of course, we heard a blog the other day from a very famous astrologer, and she was talking about this as well. So I can understand why. So that's why we're going to do a brief have a look. I'd love to spend a lot of time, but this has been quite a long blog so far. So Haumea, a Hawaiian myth, you've touched on that, but she reminds us to connect with and be comfortable with the cycles of birth, equilibrium, and death, represented interestingly by Shiva, Brahma, and Vishnu, the Trimurti, or three forms of creation. Haumea rules over fertility and childbirth. She possessed a magic stick from the makali tree that would enable her to conjure up fish and other edibles, which links her to the never-ending food supply. The astrology of Haumea is related to the love of the natural world and to the fecundity of the earth, which means that the earth has an inherent ability to create abundance if we work with her. This archetype of Haumea thus signals profound connection with nature, implying connection to source consciousness, the universal mind, whatever your name is for that, and as well as natural law to right action and to truth-telling. Haumea, which are these virtues and values, of course, of the new age. Haumea asks us to draw on our innate understanding of nature herself. And nature is, in fact, feminine energy, the Mother Earth. So we have within us, of course, that stands to reason because we have physical bodies. So therefore, we have an innate understanding of Mother Earth because she is part of our physical frames. We're supposed to be drawing on that regularly and getting in touch with it, and especially using it as a guide stick when deciding how to rebuild and reconfigure our next great institutions. Haumea's story reminds us, therefore, that we have an innate moral compass that all of us possess, but we do not always act upon. She is our source of inner strength, our spiritual connection, and the energy it gives us adaptability and versatility. Without Haumea and Sedna to guide our evolution, it is unclear to us whether humanity can successfully navigate into the age of Aquarius.
Yes, definitely. I'll just be repeating myself. She is there. It's a give and take. We can't just keep taking from her without the consequences. We need to be in a partnership with her. And do that in any way you can. Stop your children from picking the flowers, to reducing your rubbish, to do you really need a new phone every year, right? Vote with your feet and look after this beautiful planet that we live on. And especially here in New Zealand, I feel so blessed with how much nature that we have. We look out of our window and we can actually see 2 national parks here, and it's the beauty that was there well before us humans walked on the surface. So how do you our DNA, how are we evolving? How do you see this all exploding into the future?
Yeah, look, this is the last piece of this. And we weren't originally going to talk about this until you reminded me that how important this was. But for us, we've talked about the Age of Aquarius, or the fourth turning, and we gave a whole lot of examples. Richard Rudd's Gene Key 55, the Kali Yuga, Satya Yuga, transition, whatever it is, the root races and the activation of the seventh race, whichever philosophical system we talk about. What we've done today as we look to wrap this up is we've looked at the astrology charts and thought, what are the timings and the markers so that we can actually be prepared? And the first part of this we say is Saturn's transit, beginning with the blood moon next full moon in a couple of weeks' time for 3 years. That's the first part of it. That's to do with the institutions and the structures that make up our cognitive map. And then there's the movement of 17 years of Pluto through Capricorn. And then, of course, there's the morals and the myths and the stories of Sedna and Haumea. But then there was another very subtle piece that I missed, but you picked up, which was this relationship of Juno. Now, Juno, which is an asteroid, is currently in Libra, which is the sign of balanced and committed relationships, contracts, and commitments that typically are seen in the institution of marriage or long-term serious relationships. Juno represents deep twin flame as opposed to Venus, which is more, how do I talk about? We were talking about this the other day with somebody, where Juno is those deep relationships, probably a lifetime relationship, and Venus is more like the comings and goings, the romantic associations and liaisons that we have that may lead to a Juno experience. But that, just to draw the distinction between Venus, because often that is related, people talk about Venus as the love planet. Well, Juno is the planet, or is the archetype rather, of serious commitment, which is the institution of marriage or serious long-term relationships. So Juno plays a role here because she represents that twin flame or spiritually significant unions between soulmates, and that is these types of relationships that are deeply transformative on multiple planes of reality: physically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, etherically, genetically, especially when you create children out of that. With Juno in Libra in opposition to Uranus, who we hardly touched on, suffice to say that Uranus is the awakener, which is conjunct to Sedna at the moment, and Juno in Libra is opposite that in the chart. It is likely that right now in the human genome, Gene Key 55 is being activated within some of these relationships in preparation for the culmination of the fourth turning, which we think coincides with Saturn's arrival in Aries in March 2028. And the commencement of the first turning into a new 84-year cycle after that, which will start with Aries and end again in Pisces. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on there. But Aries is, of course, the opposite sign of Libra. And there's a strong relationship energetically between two signs. So that's how we've come up with, there's a strong relationship with Juno and Libra, opposite to Uranus, who is conjunct to Sedna, in terms of awakening this impulse, this genetic upgrade, if you like, will happen within these relationships. And those couples, some of them will be very aware of that. They'll feel like they've had an evolutionary leap, and there'll be lots that won't. But why will it start with the couples? Because of the multiplication effect of one, and one is much more powerful than one alone. And it is interesting also that we calculate that once Saturn arrives in Aries in March 2028, so in about 3 years' time, to begin another cycle, it will take 14 years from that point, which takes us from March 2028 to, interestingly, 2042, which is exactly 2 cycles of 7 years, that Saturn will reach Libra in his next cycle at the exact same time as Pluto will enter Aquarius, signaling that there is an undeniable and clear delineation. That will be the moment where you can draw a line in the sand and say that the transition from the darkness of Kali Yuga, materialism, to the lightness of Satya Yuga, spirit, symbolized by ethics, virtues, and values, has absolutely underway.
And how exciting is that?
It is very exciting.
There is so many different people that are talking about it is vital to what we send out, the ripple that we send out. Some of the names would be Dr. Joe Dispenza, Greg Braden, Bruce Lipton, but also I've just went to a talk with a New Zealander, Vida Austin, who does a lot of work with water consciousness, the language of water, and she also has done many experiments. And it all boils down to, if we are sending out love, light, positive energy, gratitude, the impact it has on our surroundings is unbelievable. So much so that then if there is a grumpy person in your workplace, their vibration does not affect you in the same way. And so my message to you, listener or watcher, is think how you are standing in the world right now. If you are having a dark day, be grateful for having running water, that you're able to flush your toilet, that you've got a fridge with some food in it, right? Just think about those really simple things. You might not have the perfect person in your life or the perfect job, but there are so many things that you could probably be grateful for. And with that, you're able to radiate that out and affect many, many people in such a beautiful, positive way, which is needed. Because the fourth turning, this time, if you do look into this, it is tumultuous. Doesn't matter where you are in the world, there is so much going on. There are so many people hurting in numerous ways, that being that light for someone else is the biggest change that you can make in the world. I've thoroughly enjoyed all the information you've shared today, David. Thank you so much. And again, I love that we're talking about more than just those big planets that many other astrologers are talking about. Haumea and Sedna, what beautiful information you shared today. Thank you. We will not be doing a summary. You've listened to our voices long enough today. You can listen to us on Spotify, on Apple Podcast, and you can watch us on YouTube. You can get in touch on Telegram or email. All the details will be in the description. Have you got a short parting message today, David?
Please like, share, and subscribe.
That was easy.
That's the parting message.
Thank you. So ngā mihi, until next time, when we will be talking about this beautiful lunar eclipse, blood moon in Leo. Thank you so much.
Namaste.
Namaste.